What would you do if you discovered that saving someone's life meant risking everything you've worked for? Tonight, I'm sharing the incredible true story of Sarah Martinez, a night shift nurse whose split-second decision changed two lives forever. This story will show you that sometimes the most ordinary people possess the most extraordinary courage, because stories like Sarah's deserve to be heard. The emergency department of St. Mary's General Hospital in Portland, Oregon, held the familiar weight of a Tuesday night in late October. The autumn rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, creating that distinctive Pacific Northwest atmosphere where the boundary between indoor and outdoor seemed to blur in the soft glow of hospital lighting. Sarah Martinez adjusted her stethoscope around her neck as she completed her rounds, her worn sneakers making soft squeaking sounds against the polished linoleum floor that had been mopped countless times throughout her 10-year tenure at this place she had come to consider her second home. At 34, Sarah had spent the last decade working these night shifts, finding solace in the predictable rhythm of helping people during their most vulnerable moments. She had chosen the night shift deliberately when she first started, partly because it paid better, but mostly because she preferred the quieter intensity of overnight emergencies to the chaotic bustle of daytime medicine. During these long nights, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the subtle signs that distinguished between patients who were truly in crisis and those who simply needed reassurance and basic care. Sarah had always believed she was just doing her job. Nothing more, nothing less. She clocked in at 11 p.m. with her thermos of coffee and a packed dinner that she rarely had time to eat, treated whoever came through those automatic doors with the same level of professional competence and genuine care, and clocked out at 7 a.m. feeling tired but fulfilled. It was a simple existence that allowed her to pay the rent on her modest one-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from the hospital, maintain her aging Honda Civic, and, more importantly, provided her with a sense of purpose that had sustained her through a decade of sleepless nights, difficult patients, and countless medical emergencies that tested both her professional skills and her emotional resilience. The emergency department had become as familiar to her as her own living room. She knew which vending machine dispensed the best coffee at 3 a.m., which examination room had the most comfortable chair for long procedures, and which security guard would slip her an extra blanket when the hospital's heating system inevitably failed during the coldest nights of winter. She had memorized the schedules of every doctor, learned the personal stories of the cleaning crew that worked alongside her during those quiet hours before dawn, and developed relationships with the paramedics who brought patients through those doors night after night. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air that Sarah couldn't quite place, a tension that seemed to make every sound sharper and every shadow deeper. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with their usual monotonous drone as Sarah checked on Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had been admitted earlier that evening after taking a fall in her bathroom. Mrs. Chen was recovering well from her minor injuries, but she had been asking about her cat repeatedly, worried that who would feed him while she was in the hospital. Sarah had spent extra time reassuring her, even going so far as to help her call her neighbor to arrange care for the pet. It was during this conversation with Mrs. Chen that Sarah first heard the ambulance sirens cutting through the steady patter of rain against the hospital windows. She had heard those sirens thousands of times before. They were as much a part of the soundtrack of her professional life as the beeping of heart monitors and the whispered conversations of worried families. But tonight, something about the approaching sound made her pause in the middle of adjusting Mrs. Chen's blanket. Perhaps it was the urgency in the paramedic's voice over the radio, crackling through the department's communication system with a tension that spoke of something more serious than the usual cuts, sprains, and chest pains that comprised most of their overnight cases. Or maybe it was the way her supervisor, Dr. Elizabeth Harper, straightened up from the patient chart she had been reviewing, her experienced eyes immediately alert in the way that came from 25 years of emergency medicine. Dr. Harper was the kind of physician that every nurse hoped to work with, competent, compassionate, and completely unflappable under pressure. She had been working in emergency departments since before Sarah was even in high school, and in all their years of working together, she had never seen her display anything approaching panic or uncertainty. Tonight, however, there was something in her expression that suggested this call was going to be different from the routine emergencies they typically handled. The automatic doors burst open with their familiar pneumatic hiss, accompanied by a rush of cold October air that carried the scent of rain and autumn leaves into the sterile environment of the hospital emergency department. Sarah's life changed forever in that moment, though she wouldn't fully understand the magnitude of that change for hours to come. The paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a young girl who couldn't have been more than 16 years old, her small form creating barely a ripple in the white sheets that covered the gurney. Her dark hair was matted with blood from what appeared to be a head wound, and her small frame seemed even smaller against the institutional bedding of the hospital stretcher. But it wasn't the visible injuries that immediately caught Sarah's attention and made her heart rate quicken with something that went beyond professional concern. It was the way the girl's eyes moved, darting around the room with a hypervigilance that Sarah recognized from her years of working with trauma patients. These weren't the confused, unfocused eyes of someone who had been in a serious accident and was struggling with the disorientation that typically accompanied head injuries. These were the alert, calculating eyes of someone who had been hurt by the people who were supposed to protect them, someone who had learned through bitter experience that the adults in their life could not be trusted. Sarah had seen that look before, though never in someone so young. It was the expression she had learned to recognize in the faces of domestic violence victims who came through the emergency department late at night when their injuries could no longer be hidden or explained away. It was a look that spoke of hypervigilance born from necessity, of a mind that had been trained by trauma to constantly assess and reassess the safety of every situation. The lead paramedic, a veteran named Tom Rodriguez, whom Sarah had worked with for years and had come to respect for his professionalism and his genuine care for his patients, quickly briefed Dr. Harper on the girl's condition. "Car accident," he explained, his voice carrying the brisk efficiency that came from years of delivering medical information in high-stress situations. "Single vehicle rolled 3 times before coming to rest in a ditch off Highway 26, about 20 miles east of the city." The girl had been conscious throughout the entire rescue operation, which was remarkable given the severity of the accident. However, she had been completely uncooperative with the paramedics' attempts to gather basic information. She had refused to give her name, wouldn't provide any information about her family or emergency contracts, and had become visibly agitated whenever they tried to ask questions about her medical history or current medications. From a purely medical standpoint, her injuries were serious but not immediately life-threatening. She had suffered a concussion that would require careful monitoring for signs of increased intracranial pressure. Several of her ribs were broken, which would cause significant pain but should heal with proper care and rest.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
That typically resulted from the type of accident she had been in. The car had been completely destroyed, a total loss according to the state troopers who had responded to the scene. By all rights, she should have been killed, or at least suffered injuries severe enough to require immediate surgery and an extended stay in intensive care. As they wheeled the girl toward examination room 3, Sarah found herself walking alongside the gurney, ostensibly to assist with the transfer, but really because something about the young patient had captured her attention in a way that went beyond her usual professional concern. It was during this brief journey down the hospital corridor that Sarah noticed the details that would change everything. The injuries were indeed consistent with a serious car accident. The fresh lacerations, the bruising from the impact, the way the girl held herself that suggested broken ribs. But there were other marks on her exposed arms and shoulders. Older injuries in various stages of healing that told a different story entirely. Finger-shaped bruises that were yellowing around the edges, indicating they were perhaps a week old. Small, round scars that looked like cigarette burns. A pattern of fading bruises on her upper arms that were too uniform and too strategically placed to be accidental.
Sarah had been a nurse long enough to recognize the signs of systematic abuse, even when they were partially hidden by fresh trauma from a legitimate accident. She had seen similar patterns on other patients over the years. Women who came in with broken bones that they claimed were from falls, but who also bore the telltale signs of hands that had grabbed them too hard, too often. Children who appeared in the emergency department with injuries that their parents or guardians attributed to clumsiness or accidents, but who displayed the behavioral signs of ongoing trauma. What made this case different was the combination of factors: the girl's obvious youth, her refusal to provide contact information, the way she flinched when anyone approached her too quickly, and most tellingly, the coexistence of fresh accident injuries with older signs of systematic abuse. It painted a picture that made Sarah's stomach tighten with both professional concern and personal anger. While Dr. Harper began her thorough examination of the patient, checking for internal injuries and assessing the severity of her head trauma, Sarah focused on the equally important task of making the girl feel safe and comfortable. She had learned over the years that trauma patients, especially young ones, responded better to medical treatment when they felt secure in their environment. Her approach was gentle and methodical. She spoke in the soft, reassuring tone she had perfected over years of comforting frightened patients, explaining each procedure before she performed it, and asking permission before touching the girl in any way. She adjusted the harsh overhead lighting to make it less glaring, brought extra blankets to help the girl stay warm, and positioned herself so that she was at the girl's eye level rather than looming over her in a way that might feel threatening. Gradually, some of the wariness began to fade from the girl's eyes. Sarah could see the exact moment when the patient began to trust her, even just a little. It was a subtle shift in her body language, a slight relaxation in her shoulders, a lessening of the rigid tension that had characterized her posture since she arrived. When Sarah asked her name, speaking in the same gentle voice she might use with a frightened animal, the girl hesitated for a long moment before whispering her response. "Emma." Just Emma, initially, as if she were testing whether this small revelation would bring consequences. When nothing terrible happened as a result of sharing her name, she gradually provided a bit more information. "Emma Rodriguez," she finally admitted, though she continued to refuse to provide any details about her family, her address, or how anyone could contact people who might be worried about her. She claimed she had been driving alone when the accident occurred, which seemed highly unlikely given several factors. First, she appeared to be underage, and Sarah doubted she had a valid driver's license. Second, the car had been registered to David Rodriguez, presumably her father or stepfather, which meant she had either taken the vehicle without permission or was lying about being alone. Third, her behavior suggested someone who was running away from something, rather than someone who had been out for a casual drive on a rainy Tuesday night. When Sarah gently pressed Emma for information about David, asking if he was someone who should be contacted about her condition, the girl's entire demeanor changed dramatically. This small amount of trust that Sarah had been building over the past hour seemed to evaporate instantly. The fear returned to Emma's eyes, but this time it was accompanied by something that looked almost like panic. Emma grabbed Sarah's arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone who had been in a serious accident just a few hours earlier. Her voice became urgent, desperate in a way that made Sarah's heart ache. She begged Sarah not to call David, not to tell him where she was, not to let him know that she was in the hospital. The fear in her voice was raw and genuine, the kind of terror that couldn't be faked or manufactured. It was in that moment, looking into Emma's frightened eyes and feeling the desperation in her grip, that Sarah made the first of several decisions that would define not only the remainder of her career, but also the trajectory of several lives. Instead of following the standard hospital protocol of immediately facilitating David Rodriguez's access to his legal stepdaughter, Sarah told him that Emma was still undergoing evaluation and that her condition required careful monitoring before any visitors could be allowed. She explained in her most professional tone that head injuries required extended observation periods, and premature stimulation or stress could potentially worsen Emma's condition. She suggested that he might want to wait in the family lounge while the medical team completed their assessment, and she assured him that someone would update him on Emma's progress as soon as more information was available. It was a delaying tactic, nothing more, but it bought precious time for David Kim to complete his evaluation and for Dr. Harper to fully document Emma's injuries and statements. More importantly, It gave Sarah time to figure out how to protect Emma without violating hospital policies or legal requirements that could potentially make this situation worse. Dr. Harper immediately understood what Sarah was trying to accomplish and supported the decision despite the potential legal complications it could create for the hospital. Together,
They managed to delay David's direct access to Emma for several more crucial hours while the proper authorities became involved and protective measures could be implemented. The next few hours tested Sarah's courage in ways she had never imagined possible. David Rodriguez became increasingly agitated as the delays continued, and his carefully maintained facade of concerned parenthood began to crack under the pressure. The polite, reasonable man who had initially approached the nurse's station gradually gave way to someone who was more obviously threatening and controlling. He began making veiled threats about Sarah's job security, questioning her competence and authority, and demanding to speak to someone with more power to override her decisions. He implied that he had connections within the hospital administration and the local community that could make life difficult for anyone who interfered with his parental rights. He also began making subtle but unmistakable threats about what would happen to Emma when she came home, framing them as concerns about her need for discipline and structure. Sarah found herself in the deeply uncomfortable position of having to stand up to someone who was deliberately trying to intimidate her. Throughout her career, she had always been more comfortable working behind the scenes, providing excellent patient care without drawing attention to herself or engaging in conflicts with difficult family members. She had always left the confrontational aspects of patient advocacy to doctors, social workers, or hospital administrators who were presumably better equipped to handle such situations. But now she found herself on the front lines of a battle for Emma's safety, and there was no one else to take over the responsibility. Dr. Harper was busy with other patients. David Kim was working to navigate the legal requirements for protective custody, and the hospital administrators who might normally handle such conflicts wouldn't be available until regular business hours. Sarah discovered reserves of strength and determination that she had not known she possessed. Despite her fear of confrontation and her natural tendency to avoid conflict, she stood her ground against David Rodriguez's increasingly aggressive behavior. She maintained her professional demeanor while internally battling not just her fear of this dangerous man, but also her fear of the potential consequences of her actions. She knew that if David Rodriguez decided to file a complaint against her, claiming that she had inappropriately interfered with his parental rights or denied him access to his stepdaughter without proper medical justification, she could face disciplinary action from the hospital administration. She could potentially lose her job, face legal liability, or have her nursing license called into question. But every time she wavered in her resolve, Sarah thought about Emma lying in that hospital bed, brave enough to tell her story despite her terror, trusting the adults around her to keep her safe. She thought about the pattern of old injuries hidden beneath the fresh trauma, about the fear in Emma's eyes when David's name was mentioned, and about what would happen to this courageous young woman if she were returned to her abuser's control. The turning point in the confrontation came when Maria Rodriguez arrived at the hospital. Emma's mother was exactly what Sarah had expected based on Emma's description, a small, delicate woman who seemed to move through the world as if she were trying not to take up too much space or draw too much attention to herself. Maria was probably in her late 30s, but she looked older, worn down by years of living in fear and absorbing both physical and emotional abuse. The left side of her face showed clear signs of recent bruising that had been partially covered with makeup, and she moved with the careful, guarded gait of someone whose ribs were injured and whose body had learned to expect pain. When Maria saw David in the hospital waiting area, her reaction confirmed everything that Emma had told them about their home situation. She immediately became tense and fearful, her eyes darting between David and the hospital staff as if trying to assess which represented the greater threat to her safety. She spoke to David in the submissive, placating tone that abuse victims often developed, apologizing for Emma's behavior and promising that it wouldn't happen again. David's behavior toward his wife in public, in front of hospital staff and other families, was controlling and subtly threatening in ways that made Sarah's skin crawl. He spoke to Maria as if she were a child who had failed to properly supervise her daughter, and he made it clear that he held her responsible for Emma's acting out.
Even in this public setting, he managed to convey to Maria that there would be consequences for this situation when they returned home. Maria's reunion with Emma was one of the most heartbreaking things Sarah had ever witnessed in her 10 years of working in emergency medicine. Emma broke down completely when she saw her mother, sobbing with a combination of relief, guilt, and terror that spoke of the impossible emotional burden she had been carrying. She apologized repeatedly for taking the car, for causing trouble, for getting hurt, and for creating a situation that would inevitably result in more violence when they returned home. She begged her mother's forgiveness for trying to leave, even though her attempt to escape had been motivated by a desire to protect Maria from further abuse. Maria held her daughter with a fierce protectiveness that spoke of years of trying to shield Emma from David's violence while struggling with her own helplessness in their situation. She whispered reassurances to Emma, telling her that everything would be all right, but Sarah could see in Maria's eyes that she didn't believe her own words. The conversation between Maria, Emma, Dr. Harper, and David Kim that followed revealed the full scope of the nightmare that this family had been living for years. Maria's story filled in the gaps in Emma's account, providing the adult perspective on a situation that had gradually escalated from psychological abuse to systematic violence. She described how David's drinking had progressively worsened over the years of their marriage, and how his behavior when intoxicated had become increasingly unpredictable and violent. She explained how he had gradually isolated her from her family and friends, making it difficult for her to seek help or support outside their home. She talked about the financial control David exercised over the household, how he monitored every penny she spent and required her to account for her time whenever she left the house. She described the psychological manipulation he used to make her believe that she was responsible for his violent behavior, that if she were a better wife and mother, he wouldn't need to discipline them. Most heartbreakingly, Maria revealed how she had stayed in the abusive relationship primarily to protect Emma, believing that David's threats to seriously harm her daughter if she ever tried to leave were genuine. She had convinced herself that as long as she absorbed most of David's violence, she could keep Emma relatively safe. She hadn't realized how much the situation had deteriorated until Emma's desperate escape attempt had forced her to confront the reality of their circumstances. Emma's decision to take the car and try to escape had been the catalyst that finally gave Maria the courage to consider the possibility of leaving David. When he had come home that night and discovered that both Emma and his car were missing, he had beat Maria more severely than ever before, screaming that it was her fault for raising such an ungrateful and disobedient daughter. It was only when the police had called to inform David about the accident that Maria had realized Emma was safe, at least temporarily, and that this crisis might represent an opportunity to break free from the cycle of violence that had trapped them for so many years. But she was also terrified about what would happen when David's initial shock wore off and he began planning his retaliation for this challenge to his authority. Sarah watched this family reunion with a complex mixture of heartbreak, anger, and hope. She could see the genuine love between Maria and Emma, but she could also see how damaged they both were by years of living in constant fear. She realized that helping them would require much more than simply treating Emma's immediate physical injuries. It would require challenging a system that often prioritized keeping families together over keeping individuals safe from violence. The real crisis of the night occurred around 6 a.m., as Sarah's shift was nearing an end and the hospital was beginning to transition from the quiet intensity of overnight operations.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, the busier pace of the day shift. David Kim had completed his initial assessment and was preparing to initiate formal proceedings to remove Emma from David Rodriguez's custody, at least on a temporary basis while a full investigation could be conducted. However, the legal process required to implement protective custody was complex and time-consuming, involving multiple agencies and several layers of bureaucratic approval. There would be a window of several hours, possibly extending into days, where Emma's legal status would be uncertain and where David Rodriguez might be able to use his parental rights to remove her from the hospital before the protective measures could be finalized. David Rodriguez had been waiting in the hospital lobby for most of the night, growing increasingly angry and desperate as the delays continued and it became clear that the hospital staff were not simply going to release Emma to his custody. When he learned through overheard conversations that Child Protective Services had been contacted and that Emma would likely be removed from his custody, he became openly threatening in ways that made everyone in the emergency department uncomfortable. He began demanding immediate access to Emma, claiming that the hospital was violating his constitutional rights as a parent and threatening to sue everyone involved if they continued to prevent him from making decisions about his stepdaughter's care. He also began making barely concealed threats about what would happen to Emma when she eventually came home, framing them as warnings about her need to learn respect and obedience. Sarah realized that the situation was rapidly approaching a crisis point where David's desperation might lead him to take dangerous action. She had seen enough domestic violence cases over the years to understand that abusers often escalated their behavior when they felt their control slipping away, and David Rodriguez was clearly a man who was not accustomed to having his authority challenged. The confrontation that would test Sarah's courage most severely occurred in the corridor outside Emma's room, in a space that was usually reserved for quiet conversations between medical staff and families. David Rodriguez had somehow made his way past the security measures that were supposed to keep him away from Emma's room, and he was demanding entry to see his stepdaughter immediately. Sarah positioned herself directly between David and Emma's door, despite the fact that he was significantly larger and stronger than she was, and despite her very real fear of what he might do if pushed beyond his breaking point. She could hear Emma's voice from inside the room, speaking quietly with her mother, and she was determined to not let David's presence add to the trauma this young woman had already endured. David's attempt to intimidate Sarah into backing down revealed everything about his character that Emma and Maria had been trying to communicate to the hospital staff. He used his physical size to loom over her, speaking in a low, threatening voice that was designed to convey menace without being loud enough to attract immediate attention from other hospital staff. He questioned Sarah's authority and competence, implying that she was overstepping her bounds as a mere nurse and interfering in family matters that were none of her business. He made veiled threats about her job security and suggested that he had connections in the hospital administration who would ensure that she faced consequences for her interference. Most disturbingly, he began making statements about Emma that revealed his true feelings about his stepdaughter. He referred to her as ungrateful, manipulative, and prone to lying about situations to get attention. He suggested that she had probably made up stories about being abused in order to avoid taking responsibility for stealing his car and causing the accident. But Sarah had spent 10 years working night shifts in an emergency department, dealing with people in crisis, people under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and people who were angry, frightened, or desperate. She had developed her own kind of strength through these experiences, a quiet but unshakable resolve that allowed her to remain calm under pressure and advocate for patients who needed someone in their corner. She refused to be intimidated by David's physical presence or his threats. Instead, she spoke to him in the same calm, professional tone she had used with thousands of other difficult family members over the years. She explained that Emma's medical condition required careful monitoring and that any unnecessary stress or stimulation could potentially worsen her injuries. She used her knowledge of hospital protocol and her professional authority to justify the restrictions on David's access to Emma, framing them in terms of medical necessity rather than personal judgment. She also made it clear that other hospital staff were aware of the situation and would be checking on them regularly, subtly indicating that his behavior was being observed and documented. The standoff in the corridor lasted nearly 20 minutes, with David becoming increasingly agitated and Sarah remaining steadily calm. Other hospital staff began to gather at a respectful distance, sensing the tension and ready to intervene if the situation escalated to violence. Security had been quietly called to the scene, and David Kim was working to expedite the legal processes that would provide Emma with official protection. Sarah knew that she was taking a significant professional risk by so openly defying someone who had legal authority over Emma's care.
If David Rodriguez decided to file a formal complaint, claiming that she had inappropriately interfered with his parental rights, she could face disciplinary action that might affect her career for years to come. But she also knew that she couldn't live with herself if she allowed Emma to be taken back to an abusive situation simply because following protocol was safer for her personally. She had seen too much evidence of the violence this family had endured, had looked into Emma's terrified eyes when David's name was mentioned, and had witnessed Maria's fearful reaction to her husband's presence. The resolution of the crisis came when 2 police officers arrived at the hospital, responding to David Kim's request for assistance with a child protection case. The officers were experienced in dealing with domestic violence situations, and they had been briefed by David Kim about the suspected abuse and the family dynamics they were walking into. David Rodriguez's demeanor changed completely when he saw the police uniforms. The aggressive, threatening man who had been trying to intimidate Sarah immediately transformed back into the concerned, reasonable parent persona he had used when he first arrived at the hospital. He began explaining to the officers that there had been a misunderstanding, that his stepdaughter was troubled and prone to exaggeration, and that the hospital staff had been misled by her stories. However, the officers had seen this performance countless times before in other domestic violence cases, and they weren't fooled by David's sudden change in behavior. They had been trained to recognize the signs of abusive relationships and to understand the complex dynamics that kept victims trapped in dangerous situations. More importantly, they took the time to speak with Emma directly, in a private setting where she could share her experiences without fear of immediate retaliation from David. They also observed Emma's physical reaction to David's presence, noting the fear in her eyes and the way she instinctively tried to make herself smaller and less noticeable whenever he was nearby. The moment that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life came when Emma, despite her injuries and her very real fear of the consequences, found the courage to tell the police officers that she did not want to go home with David Rodriguez. She was shaking as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but she managed to clearly state that she was afraid of him and that she believed he would hurt both her and her mother if they were forced to return to his house. Emma's statement to the police officers was the beginning of the end of David Rodriguez's control over his family. Combined with the medical evidence of ongoing abuse, Maria's corroborating testimony, and David Kim's professional assessment of the family's situation, the officers had more than enough evidence to justify emergency protective measures. David Rodriguez was arrested that morning on charges of domestic violence and child abuse. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Emma's medical records documenting both fresh and old injuries, Maria's visible signs of recent violence, testimony from hospital staff
who had witnessed his threatening behavior, and most importantly, the brave statements from both Emma and Maria about the pattern of abuse they had endured for years. The formal charges that followed would eventually result in David's conviction and imprisonment, ensuring that Emma and Maria would be protected while they rebuilt their lives. But even more significantly, Emma's courage in speaking out had broken the cycle of silence and fear that had kept this family trapped in violence for so many years. Sarah stayed at the hospital for 3 hours past the end of her shift, ensuring that Emma was medically stable and that all the necessary legal and bureaucratic paperwork was completed properly. She wanted to make sure that there were no gaps in the documentation that could potentially be used to challenge Emma's removal from David's custody or to question the hospital's handling of the situation. She watched as Maria sat beside Emma's hospital bed, holding her daughter's hand and speaking quietly about their plans for the immediate future. For the first time since they had arrived at the hospital nearly 8 hours earlier, both mother and daughter looked hopeful rather than fearful. They were still facing significant challenges. They had nowhere to live, limited financial resources, and years of trauma to work through. But they were finally free from the daily terror of living with an abuser. Dr. Harper found Sarah in the break room as she was finally preparing to leave the hospital and drive home to get some much-needed sleep. The older physician had been working in emergency medicine for over 2 decades, and she had seen many nurses come and go during her career. Some were competent but uninspired. Others were skilled but burned out.
and a few were truly exceptional in ways that made a lasting difference in the lives of their patients. Dr. Harper told Sarah that what she had witnessed that night was something special, a reminder of why they had all chosen to work in healthcare in the first place. She explained that Sarah's willingness to take personal and professional risks to protect Emma had probably saved not just the girl's life, but potentially Maria's life as well. The conversation between Sarah and Dr. Harper was brief but meaningful. Dr. Harper pointed out that many healthcare professionals became so focused on following established protocols and avoiding liability that they sometimes forgot that their primary obligation was to their patients' well-being. She praised Sarah for having the courage to trust her instincts about what Emma needed, even when it meant challenging authority and taking calculated risks. Dr. Harper also mentioned that Sarah's actions that night had demonstrated leadership qualities that suggested she might want to consider advancing her career into roles where she could have a broader impact on patient care and staff training. She suggested that Sarah think about pursuing additional education or certifications that would allow her to take on supervisory responsibilities or specialize in areas like domestic violence intervention. Sarah drove home that morning as the sun was rising over Portland, feeling physically exhausted but emotionally energized in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The city looked different to her somehow, as if the events of the night had changed not just her understanding of her own capabilities, but her entire perspective on her role in the world. She'd always known that she was competent at her job, but she had never realized that she possessed the kind of moral courage that could make a genuine difference in someone's life. The experience with Emma had shown her that sometimes being a nurse meant much more than providing medical care. Sometimes it meant being willing to stand up for people who couldn't protect themselves, even when doing so was frightening or potentially costly. Over the following weeks and months, Sarah maintained contact with Emma and Maria as they navigated the complex legal system and began the difficult but hopeful process of rebuilding their lives. Emma required several follow-up appointments to monitor her recovery from the concussion and broken ribs, and Sarah made sure she was personally involved in her care whenever her schedule allowed. The legal proceedings against David Rodriguez moved forward steadily and effectively. The evidence of systematic abuse was overwhelming and well documented, including Emma's medical records, photographs of Maria's injuries, testimony from neighbors who had heard violent arguments coming from the Rodriguez household, and statements from Emma's teachers who had noticed changes in her behavior and academic performance over the years. David ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a trial that would have resulted in even more severe consequences. He was sentenced to several years in prison for multiple charges of domestic violence and child abuse, with additional restrictions that would prevent him from contacting Emma or Maria after his release. The legal resolution provided both mother and daughter with the security of knowing that they would be safe from retaliation for the foreseeable future. More importantly, Emma and Maria began the challenging but hopeful process of healing from years of trauma and learning to live without the constant fear that had dominated their lives for so long. They moved in with Maria's sister in a different part of the city, reconnecting with family members who had been kept at a distance by David's controlling behavior. Both began attending counseling sessions to help them process their experiences and develop healthier coping mechanisms for dealing with stress and conflict. Emma, in particular, showed remarkable resilience and determination to not let her experiences define her future. With the support of her family and her counselors, she began to flourish both academically and socially. Sarah's role in Emma's recovery extended well beyond her professional responsibilities as a nurse. She found herself becoming something of a mentor to the teenager, helping her understand that what had happened to her wasn't her fault and that her survival and courage were sources of strength rather than shame. Emma's resilience and determination to build a better life for herself and her mother inspired Sarah in ways she hadn't expected. The young woman's courage in the face of trauma, her willingness to trust strangers with her story, and her commitment to protecting her mother even at great personal cost had shown Sarah what real bravery looked like. The experience with Emma also fundamentally changed Sarah's perspective on her own career and capabilities. She began to see herself not just as someone who followed medical protocols competently, but as someone who could be a genuine advocate for vulnerable patients who needed someone to fight for their safety and well-being. She paid much closer attention to the subtle signs of abuse and neglect in the patients she treated, and she became known among her colleagues as someone who would go the extra mile to ensure that victims of violence received not just medical care, but also the resources and support they needed to escape dangerous situations. Dr. Harper recognized the transformation in Sarah's approach to her work and began giving her additional responsibilities, including training new nurses on how to recognize and respond appropriately to signs of domestic violence. Sarah discovered that she had a natural talent for teaching and for helping other healthcare professionals understand the importance of looking beyond obvious medical issues to see the whole person and their circumstances. She developed training materials that helped hospital staff understand the complex dynamics of abusive relationships, the reasons why victims often couldn't simply leave dangerous situations, and the ways that healthcare professionals could provide support without inadvertently making situations worse. Her programs became models for other hospitals in the region, extending the impact of Emma's case far beyond St. Mary's General Hospital. 6 months after that transformative October night, Sarah received a card from Emma that she would treasure for the rest of her career. The teenager had not only recovered fully from her physical injuries, but had also made the honor roll at her new school and had been accepted into a special program for students interested in pursuing careers in healthcare. Emma wrote that she wanted to become a nurse like Sarah so that she could help other people the way Sarah had helped her and her mother. She had realized during her recovery that she wanted to dedicate her life to being there for people during their most vulnerable moments, just as Sarah had been there for her when she needed someone to believe her story and fight for her safety.
The card contained a simple but profound message that brought tears to Sarah's eyes and validated every risk she had taken that night. Emma wrote that Sarah had shown her what true courage looked like, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right even when you were scared. She thanked Sarah for believing in her when she couldn't believe in herself, and for fighting for her when she was too injured and frightened to fight for herself. Reading Emma's words, Sarah realized that the night she had stood in that hospital corridor, refusing to let David Rodriguez intimidate her into backing down, had been the moment she had discovered who she really was and what she was capable of accomplishing. She had always thought of herself as quiet and unassuming, someone who preferred to avoid confrontation and work behind the scenes rather than taking center stage. But when it had mattered most, when a vulnerable young person had needed someone to stand up for her, Sarah had found reserves of strength and courage that she hadn't known she possessed. She had learned that heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting despite fear, when someone needed you to be brave. Sarah's story became something of a legend at St. Mary's General Hospital, shared informally among staff members as an example of the kind of patient advocacy that the institution valued and expected from its employees. New nurses and residents would hear about the nurse who had risked her career to protect a patient from an abusive family member, and it became a teaching tool for discussions about professional ethics and patient rights. The story was eventually incorporated into formal training programs, illustrating the importance of healthcare professionals who were willing to trust their instincts, take calculated risks, and advocate for their patients, even when doing so was difficult or potentially costly to their careers. Sarah's example showed that following protocol wasn't always enough. Sometimes protecting patients required courage, creativity, and a willingness to challenge systems that weren't working. The impact of Sarah's courage extended far beyond Emma and Maria's individual situation. Other patients who had been in abusive relationships began to feel safer about reporting their circumstances to hospital staff, knowing that they would be believed, supported, and protected, rather than simply processed through bureaucratic procedures. The hospital developed new protocols for identifying and responding to domestic violence cases, with Sarah playing a key role in creating training programs that helped all staff members recognize the signs of abuse and understand their role in protecting vulnerable patients. These protocols were eventually adopted by other hospitals throughout the region, creating a network of healthcare facilities that prioritized patient safety and well-being over administrative convenience. Emma did indeed pursue a career in healthcare, inspired by Sarah's example of what it meant to be a healing professional who saw patients as whole human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and protection. She studied diligently throughout high school, volunteered at local hospitals and clinics, and eventually earned a full scholarship to nursing school. Throughout her education, Emma stayed in close touch with Sarah, who became not just a professional mentor, but a lifelong friend and role model. Their relationship demonstrated the lasting impact that one person's courage could have, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the original crisis and continued to influence lives for years to come. Maria also found her own strength and voice in the aftermath of her escape from David Rodriguez. She returned to school to complete the education that had been interrupted by years of abuse and financial instability. She eventually became a social worker, specializing in helping families escape abusive situations, using her personal experience to connect with and support other victims of domestic violence. She often spoke at hospitals, community organizations, and professional conferences about the crucial role that healthcare professionals could play in identifying and responding to domestic violence cases. She credited Sarah with not just saving her daughter's life, but with showing her what it looked like when someone was willing to take personal risks to protect vulnerable people. The ripple effects of that October night continued to spread for years, touching the lives of countless individuals who never knew the specific details of Emma's story, but who benefited from the changes it had inspired. The protocols developed at St. Mary's influenced policy at hospitals across the country. The training programs that Sarah created were used to educate thousands of healthcare professionals about domestic violence intervention. Most importantly, Emma and Maria's successful escape from abuse inspired other victims to seek help, knowing that there were people like Sarah who would believe their stories and fight for their safety, even when it was difficult or risky to do so. 10 years after that transformative night, Sarah had advanced to become the director of nursing for the emergency department at St. Mary's General Hospital. She had used her position to build a culture that prioritized patient safety and advocacy, training generations of nurses to see their role as extending beyond medical care to encompass protection and support for vulnerable individuals. Her reputation extended throughout the regional healthcare community as someone who had demonstrated that ordinary people doing their everyday jobs with extraordinary compassion and courage could change lives and inspire systemic improvements that protected countless others. Emma had graduated from nursing school with honors and was working in a pediatric emergency department at a different hospital, carrying forward the lessons she had learned from Sarah about the importance of seeing patients as whole human beings deserving of dignity and protection. She regularly told colleagues about the nurse who had saved her life by being willing to take risks to do what was right. The story of that October night had become a teaching tool used in nursing schools and medical programs throughout the region, illustrating the profound impact that healthcare professionals could have when they were willing to advocate courageously for their patients. It showed that heroism wasn't about having special powers or being fearless. It was about recognizing when someone needed help and having the moral courage to act on that recognition. Sarah often reflected on how different her life and career might have been if she had chosen to follow standard protocol that night, instead of trusting her instincts about Emma's situation. She realized that many healthcare professionals faced similar moments of choice throughout their careers, opportunities to either play it safe or take risks to protect vulnerable patients. Her hope was that her example would encourage others to choose courage when it mattered most, to trust their professional instincts about patient safety, and to remember that their primary obligation was always to the well-being of the people they served, rather than bureaucratic convenience or personal security. The transformation that had begun in Sarah during those crucial hours had continued throughout her career, as she never stopped learning about herself and discovering new ways to use her skills, knowledge, and position to help vulnerable patients and to inspire other healthcare professionals to see their work as a calling rather than simply a job. Emma's success in her nursing career remained a constant source of pride and inspiration for Sarah. Watching Emma grow from a frightened, injured teenager into a confident, compassionate healthcare professional reinforced Sarah's belief that one act of courage could have effects that lasted for generations, creating positive change that extended far beyond the original act of bravery. The night that had changed everything for Sarah, Emma, and Maria had occurred more than a decade ago, but its effects continued to ripple outward through their lives and the lives of everyone they touched. The protocols and training programs that had grown out of Emma's case were now being used to train healthcare professionals across the country, ensuring that Sarah's example of courageous patient advocacy would continue to influence the treatment of vulnerable patients for years to come. Most importantly, countless individuals had received better, more compassionate care because healthcare professionals had been inspired by Sarah's example to look beyond
Obvious medical issues and advocate for their patients' overall safety and well-being. Emma's story had shown that one person's willingness to take risks to protect a vulnerable individual could create lasting change that protected countless others. Sarah's legacy was not just in the individual lives she had touched directly, but in the culture of caring and advocacy that her example had helped create throughout the healthcare community. She had demonstrated that extraordinary courage could be found in ordinary people who chose to act on their convictions when someone needed them to be brave. The most important lesson from Sarah's story was that heroism came in many forms, but it always involved the willingness to put someone else's well-being above your own comfort, security, or convenience. Sarah had shown that you didn't need superpowers to be a hero. You just needed to care deeply enough about other people to be willing to take risks to protect them from harm. Her story continued to inspire new generations of healthcare professionals to see their work as more than just a job, to understand that they had the power to change lives through acts of courage, compassion, and advocacy that went beyond medical protocols to encompass genuine care for the whole person. Dr. Harper was the kind of experienced physician who had seen every variation of human trauma and tragedy that could walk or be carried through the doors of an emergency department. She had been working in emergency medicine since before Sarah was even in high school, starting her career in a busy urban hospital in Chicago before eventually moving to Portland to raise her family. Over her 25-year career, she had treated gunshot victims and heart attack patients, had delivered babies in hospital corridors when there wasn't time to get to the maternity ward, and had held the hands of dying patients whose families couldn't make it to the hospital in time to say goodbye. She was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair that she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail that stayed neat throughout even the most chaotic shifts. Her eyes were a warm brown, but they carried the weight of having witnessed both the best and worst of humanity. She had hired Sarah 10 years ago, recognizing something in the younger woman that went beyond technical competence or professional training. Over the years, she had watched Sarah develop from an eager but sometimes uncertain young nurse into someone with almost uncanny ability to connect with patients in crisis and provide exactly the kind of care they needed. Dr. Harper had built her reputation not just on her medical expertise, but on her ability to see her patients as complete human beings, rather than simply collections of symptoms to be treated. She understood that healing required more than just addressing physical injuries. It required creating an environment where patients felt safe, respected, and cared for as individuals. This philosophy had guided her throughout her career and had influenced every nurse and resident she had worked with over the years.
As Dr. Harper completed her examination of Emma, she made careful notes about all the injuries she observed, both the fresh trauma from the car accident and the older signs of systematic abuse that were partially hidden beneath the more recent damage. Her documentation was meticulous, not just because she was naturally thorough, but because she suspected that these medical records might eventually become important evidence in legal proceedings. Hospital protocol required them to contact the patient's emergency contacts within a reasonable time frame, particularly in the case of a minor who had been involved in a serious accident. The standard procedure would have been to immediately call David Rodriguez, explain Emma's condition, and arrange for him to come to the hospital to make decisions about her ongoing care. However, something about Emma's desperate plea and the pattern of old injuries gave both women pause. Dr. Harper decided to speak with Sarah privately, away from Emma's room where their conversation couldn't be overheard by the patient. The conversation took place in the small break room, adjacent to the emergency department, a cramped space that contained 2 uncomfortable chairs, a refrigerator that had been making strange noises for the past 6 months, and a coffee maker that produced something that only barely resembled actual coffee. It was a space that had witnessed countless difficult discussions over the years, where medical staff had debated treatment options, discussed terminal diagnoses, and tried to process the emotional impact of particularly challenging cases. Dr. Harper's voice was quiet, but firm as she explained what they were both seeing in Emma's case. The pattern of injuries suggested ongoing physical abuse that had been occurring over an extended period of time. The girl's behavior was entirely consistent with that of a trauma victim who had been systematically victimized by someone in a position of authority over her. The fact that she was terrified of having David Rodriguez contacted suggested that he was likely the source of the abuse, or at minimum, someone who had failed to protect her from it. However, they were also dealing with a minor, which complicated their options significantly. Emma was not legally able to make her own medical decisions, which meant that someone with parental authority would need to be involved in her care. If David Rodriguez was indeed abusive, involving him in Emma's treatment could potentially put her in more danger. But failing to follow proper protocol could expose the hospital to legal liability and could potentially jeopardize Emma's care if her legal guardian decided to transfer her to another facility. Dr. Harper had been in similar situations before, though never one quite this clear-cut in terms of the evidence of abuse. She had learned over the years that sometimes protecting patients required calculated risks and trusting professional instincts over bureaucratic procedures. She made the decision to delay contacting Emma's family until they could get more information about her situation and potentially involve Child Protective Services. Sarah found herself thinking about her own childhood as she listened to Dr. Harper's assessment of Emma's situation. She had grown up with a single mother who had worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat after Sarah's father had abandoned the family when Sarah was just 7 years old. Her mother, Maria Martinez, had cleaned office buildings downtown during the early morning hours and worked as a cashier at a grocery store in the afternoons and evenings. Money had always been tight, and there had been times when Sarah had gone to bed hungry or worn shoes with holes in them because her mother couldn't afford to replace them immediately. But despite their financial struggles, Sarah had never doubted that she was loved and protected. Her mother had been fierce in her dedication to keeping Sarah safe, even when that meant making significant personal sacrifices. She remembered what it felt like to feel powerless as a child, to depend entirely on adults who might or might not have her best interests at heart. The difference was that Sarah had been incredibly fortunate. Her mother had been loving and protective, willing to work herself to exhaustion to provide for her daughter. Emma clearly hadn't been so fortunate. And the thought of this brave young woman living in fear and experiencing violence from the very people who should have been protecting her made Sarah's heart ache with both compassion and anger. The hospital's social worker, David Kim, arrived at the emergency department about an hour after Emma had been admitted. He was a man in his early 40s who had been working in Child Protective Services for over 15 years, and his experience showed in the careful, methodical way he approached every case that came to his attention. Sarah had worked with David on several difficult cases over the years and had developed a deep respect for his dedication to protecting vulnerable children, even when that meant navigating complex legal and bureaucratic challenges. David was Korean American, the son of immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to put him through college and social work school.
His personal background had given him a deep understanding of the challenges faced by families under stress, and his professional experience had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of abuse and neglect that other people might miss or dismiss. He had a gentle manner that helped put frightened children at ease, but he also possessed the kind of quiet strength that allowed him to stand up to abusive adults when necessary. His conversation with Emma was conducted with the kind of careful sensitivity that came from years of working with traumatized children. He explained who he was and why he was there, making it clear that his primary concern was her safety and well-being rather than enforcing rules or determining blame. He spoke to her as if she were an adult, capable of making her own decisions, with even little too frequently or entirely unnecessary. And she listened with a sense of utter desperation.
Making her own decisions, which seemed to help her feel less powerless and more willing to share information about her situation. David had learned over the years that children who had been systematically abused often had very sophisticated survival instincts. They had learned to read adult emotions and motivations with remarkable accuracy, and they could usually tell the difference between adults who genuinely cared about their welfare and those who were simply following procedures or trying to assert authority. Emma seemed to recognize that David was someone she could potentially trust, though she remained guarded and cautious throughout their initial conversation. The story that gradually emerged over the next several hours was heartbreaking, but unfortunately all too familiar to the experienced professionals gathered around Emma's bedside. She lived with her mother, Maria, and her stepfather, David Rodriguez, in a small house in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland. The house had been David's before the marriage, and Emma and her mother had moved in with him when Emma was 10 years old. Emma's biological father had been killed in a construction accident when she was 8 years old, leaving her mother widowed with a young daughter and very few financial resources. Maria had been working as a housekeeper for several wealthy families in the Portland suburbs, but her income was barely enough to cover rent and basic necessities. The death of Emma's father had been devastating emotionally, but it had also created serious financial hardship for the small family. David Rodriguez had seemed like the answer to their prayers when he entered their lives 2 years after Emma's father's death. He had a steady job at a local manufacturing plant where he operated heavy machinery and earned what seemed like good money to a family that had been struggling financially. He owned his own home, had a reliable truck, and seemed to genuinely care for both Maria and Emma. During their courtship, David had been charming and attentive. He had taken Maria on dates to nice restaurants, brought flowers for her and small gifts for Emma, and had seemed genuinely interested in becoming a family with them. He had talked about wanting to provide stability and security for them, about being the kind of father figure that Emma needed, and about building a life together that would give them all the things they had been lacking. The wedding had been small but happy, held in the backyard of the house where they would all be living together. Emma had been excited about having a father figure again, and Maria had been relieved to finally have some financial security and emotional support. For the first few months after the wedding, everything had seemed perfect. However, the situation had begun to deteriorate gradually but steadily. David had a drinking problem that became progressively worse after the stress and financial pressures of suddenly supporting a wife and stepdaughter began to take their toll. When he drank, which became increasingly frequent, his personality changed completely. The charming, caring man who had courted Maria disappeared, replaced by someone who was angry, controlling, and increasingly violent. The abuse had started with verbal attacks and psychological manipulation. David would criticize everything Maria did, her cooking, her housekeeping, the way she dressed, how she spent money. He gradually isolated her from her friends and family, claiming that they didn't really care about her and that he was the only person she could truly rely on. He controlled the household finances completely, giving Maria a small allowance for groceries and other necessities, but requiring her to account for every penny she spent. Maria's mother had borne the brunt of the abuse for the first few years of the marriage, and Emma had learned to hide in her room when the shouting started. She would put on headphones and listen to music, or bury her head under pillows and try to block out the sounds of her mother being verbally and eventually physically attacked.
She felt helpless and guilty about her inability to protect her mother, but she was also terrified of drawing David's attention to herself. As Emma grew older and began to develop her own opinions and independence, particularly as she entered her teenage years, David's attention had increasingly turned to her. He began to criticize her appearance, her friends, her grades at school, and her attitude toward him. He implemented strict rules about where she could go, who she could see, and how she could spend her time. Any violation of these rules, or even any perceived disrespect, resulted in punishment that escalated from verbal abuse to physical violence. The physical abuse of Emma had escalated significantly over the past year as she had grown more mature and more willing to stand up for herself and for Mother. What had started as occasional slaps or shoves had become regular beatings that left her with bruises, cuts, and other injuries that she had to carefully hide from teachers, friends, and other adults who might ask questions. Emma had become expert at covering bruises with makeup, wearing long sleeves even in warm weather to hide marks on her arms, and crafting believable explanations for any injuries that couldn't be completely concealed. She had learned to walk differently when her ribs were bruised, to avoid certain movements that might reveal her pain, and to maintain a cheerful facade at school even when she was in significant physical discomfort. The car accident that had brought Emma to the hospital had occurred after what she described as the worst confrontation she had ever experienced with David. It had started as an argument about Emma's curfew. She had been 5 minutes late coming home from her job at a local fast food restaurant, and David had been drinking heavily while waiting for her return. When Emma had tried to explain that her manager had asked her to stay late to help close the restaurant, David had erupted in a rage that was more intense than anything Emma had experienced before. He had accused her of lying, of sneaking around with boys, of being disrespectful and ungrateful for everything he had provided for her and her mother. The situation had escalated when Emma's mother had tried to defend her daughter, pointing out that Emma was actually very responsible and had never given them any serious problems. David's anger then turned on Maria, and he had begun hitting her with a ferocity that terrified Emma. Without thinking about the potential consequences, Emma had jumped between her stepfather and her mother, trying to physically protect Maria from the assault. David had backhanded Emma so hard that she had fallen backward and struck her head on the corner of the coffee table, opening a gash that had bled profusely and left her momentarily stunned. The sight of Emma's blood had seemed to shock David out of his rage, but instead of showing concern for her injury, he had become paranoid about the potential consequences if anyone discovered what had happened. He had threatened both Emma and her mother, telling them that if anyone asked about Emma's injury, they would say she had fallen down the stairs. And he had also made it clear that if either of them ever reported his behavior to authorities, the consequences would be far worse than anything they had experienced so far. Then he had left the house, presumably to go to a bar to continue drinking. Frightened and desperate, and with her head injury making it difficult to think clearly, Emma made the impulsive decision to take David's car keys and try to leave the house. Her plan had been to drive to her grandmother's house in Salem, about an hour south of Portland. Her grandmother was her mother's mother, and Emma had always felt safe there during the few visits they had been allowed to make over the years. Emma had never driven a car before, having been denied the opportunity to get a driver's license despite being old enough because David claimed they couldn't afford the insurance. Her inexperience behind the wheel, combined with her emotional state and the head injury she had sustained, created a dangerous situation that became tragic when the combination of unfamiliar controls, dark rural roads, and steady rain caused her to lose control of the vehicle. The car had slid off the wet pavement, rolled down an embankment, and come to rest in a drainage ditch. Emma had remained conscious throughout the terrifying experience, trapped inside the overturned vehicle for nearly an hour before other drivers had noticed the accident and called for help. The rescue had required specialized equipment to extract Emma
her safely from the wreckage, and it was genuinely miraculous that she had survived with only the injuries that brought her to the hospital. As Emma told her story to Sarah, Dr. Harper, and David Kim, speaking in a voice that was sometimes barely above a whisper,
Sarah felt something fundamental shifting inside her heart and mind. She had always prided herself on maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, on being compassionate and caring without becoming personally invested in her patients' lives beyond their immediate medical needs. Throughout her 10 years of working in the emergency department, Sarah had treated countless patients whose personal circumstances were tragic, complicated, or heartbreaking. She had learned to provide excellent medical care while maintaining the emotional distance necessary to function effectively in a job that regularly exposed her to human suffering. She had told herself many times that her role was to treat injuries and illnesses, not to solve the complex social and personal problems that often contributed to those medical conditions. But something about Emma's courage in sharing her story, despite her fear and vulnerability, touched something deep within Sarah's heart that she hadn't even realized was there. Here was a 16-year-old girl who had survived not just a serious car accident, but years of systematic abuse and terror. Despite everything she had endured, Emma had found the strength to try to protect her mother, even knowing that it would result in her own punishment. She had risked her life in an attempt to find safety, and now she was trusting virtual strangers with the truth about her situation. Sarah began to realize that Emma's situation represented everything she had originally become a nurse to fight against: the helplessness of innocent people caught in circumstances beyond their control, the failure of systems that were supposed to protect the vulnerable, and the way that victims of abuse were often re-victimized by bureaucratic procedures that prioritized convenience over safety. She thought about all the times over the years when she'd followed protocol, done her job competently and professionally, and sent patients back into situations that weren't ideal, telling herself that it wasn't her responsibility to fix their lives beyond providing medical care. She had always believed that she was just one person, that she couldn't possibly make a difference in the larger social problems that contributed to so much of the suffering she witnessed in the emergency department. But looking at Emma, seeing the courage and resilience in someone so young, Sarah knew that this time would be different. She couldn't simply follow protocol and hope for the best. She couldn't document Emma's injuries, provide the necessary medical treatment, and then allow her to be returned to a situation where she would continue to be victimized. This time, she would have to find the courage to do more, even if it meant taking risks that could jeopardize her career. Dr. Harper and David Kim were discussing the next steps in Emma's case, carefully outlining the established procedures for reporting suspected child abuse and initiating protective custody proceedings. They would need to contact Child Protective Services immediately, document Emma's injuries and statements thoroughly, and begin the complex legal process of investigating her home situation while ensuring her immediate safety. It was a system that had been developed over decades of working with abused children, refined through countless cases, and informed by the hard-learned lessons of situations where children had fallen through bureaucratic cracks or been returned to dangerous homes. The professionals involved in Emma's case were all experienced and dedicated, and they understood both the importance of following proper procedures and the potential limitations of those procedures. However, Sarah knew from her years of working in the emergency department that the system, while generally effective, wasn't perfect. There were always gaps between the ideal of protecting vulnerable children and the reality of limited resources, legal constraints, and the complex dynamics of family situations. Sometimes children fell through those cracks. Sometimes bureaucratic delays put them at risk. And sometimes the very procedures designed to protect them ended up making their situations worse. The first real test of Sarah's resolve came sooner than she had expected, and in a way that would force her to confront her own fears about confrontation and authority. At approximately 3 a.m., about 4 hours after Emma had been admitted to the hospital, a man arrived at the emergency department demanding to see his stepdaughter. David Rodriguez was exactly what Sarah had imagined based on Emma's description, but seeing him in person was still somehow shocking. He was a large, imposing man in his 40s, probably about 6 feet tall and easily weighing over 200 pounds.
He had the kind of physical presence that immediately commanded attention and suggested that he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. His clothes were rumpled and he smelled strongly of alcohol, though he wasn't obviously intoxicated enough to be denied entry to the hospital. David's demeanor was carefully controlled, but Sarah could sense the anger simmering beneath the surface like a pot of water just before it reaches boiling point. He presented himself as a concerned parent who was worried about his stepdaughter after receiving a call from the police about her involvement in a serious car accident. He had identification proving his relationship to Emma, legal documentation of his parental authority over her, and all the bureaucratic standing necessary to demand information about her condition and to make decisions about her ongoing care. The conversation between David Rodriguez and the hospital staff took place at the nurse's station with other patients and family members nearby, which meant that everyone involved in the conversation had to maintain professional demeanors while navigating an increasingly tense situation. David was polite but insistent, explaining that he had been frantic with worry when he discovered that both Emma and his car were missing from the house. He presented a carefully crafted narrative that painted himself as the victim of a troubled teenager's acting out. According to his version of events, Emma was prone to dramatic behavior, had a history of running away when she didn't get her way, and had stolen his car without permission after an argument about her curfew. He claimed that he was simply trying to be a good father to a difficult teenager, and that he needed to take her home where she could recover from her injuries and familiar surroundings. Sarah listened to David's story and recognized the careful manipulation in his words. She had seen this pattern before in other domestic violence cases, the way that abusers could present themselves as reasonable, concerned family members while subtly shifting blame onto their victims. David was using just enough truth to make his story believable to someone who didn't know the full situation, while carefully omitting any details that might raise questions about his own behavior. He talked about Emma's behavioral problems and her tendency to exaggerate situations in a way that was designed to discredit anything she might have said about her home life. He mentioned his financial concerns about the destroyed car and the medical bills that would result from her reckless behavior, presenting himself as a hard-working man who was being burdened by the consequences of his stepdaughter's poor decisions. It was a performance that Sarah suspected David had given many times before, to teachers who had noticed Emma's injuries, to neighbors who might have heard arguments from the house, and probably to other medical professionals who had treated Emma for previous accidents. It was the kind of carefully rehearsed explanation that abusers developed to deflect suspicion and maintain their control over their victims.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.